Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of the Universe Within podcast. Today, I sat down with Mark Flaherty, and Mark is someone who was recommended to me by a couple friends of mine. And the show is a little different. He's actually an astrologer, which is something I don't know a lot about, but I'm really interested in the stars and cosmology and really based on a lot of my own interest in ancient cultures and really the reverence that they had for the stars and astrological symbols and myths. So I found this podcast really interesting. He's a really interesting guy. I enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you all like it. He actually came to astrology, interestingly, through plant medicine, so he has a really interesting story. So if you are watching on YouTube, if you can hit the subscribe button and turn on the notifications, the little bell next to that, that would be really beneficial. And if you are listening, if you can go on Apple Podcasts and leave a starred rating and a review, that would really help in getting the show out. So thank you guys. And without further ado, here is Mark. This is kind of an interesting podcast for me because usually it's more plant medicine and things like that. But I did an interview with Bernard, and he really recommended you very highly. And then also I'm friends with Steph here, and we were having dinner one night, and she recommended I talk to you. So I figured I would. And then it's also interesting because I had two guests scheduled before you who I shot, but they're both offline for a few weeks. So I'm pushing it back. And so you're actually in podcast number 11.
Okay.
Which is interesting because that's a really serendipitous number for me. Maybe we'll get into it more later, but it seems actually very fitting in the end that you're number 11. So I don't know much about you. I read a little bit of your website, and it seemed like you came to astrology through working with plant medicine, which I found quite interesting. How did that come about?
Well, I mean, even before plant medicine, so basically until I was 30, I was working as a computer programmer, total skeptic about everything, astrology, any kind of spirit stuff. But there was also a part of me that was so curious and wanted to know. I was like an avid seeker and a complete skeptic at the same time. And firstly, I came to ayahuasca just I was traveling in Peru, in South America, and heard about it, heard some stories from friends, and I was like, okay, I need to do that. I'm not happy, basically. And that basically then triggered a very long and quite hideous physical healing journey, which led me to move to the jungle and live there for many years.
And when was that?
So I first drank ayahuasca in 2004, and then the next year I moved to the jungle, thinking it might be a month or two, and not the whole time, but basically it was another 12 years before I left the jungle.
Wow. I
would come and go a little bit, but long periods of living there. And in April 2010, on one of the retreats I was on, one of the then apprentice shamans was an English guy who'd been an astrologer for, at that point, about 25 or 30 years. And he just gave a 1 hour overview during a retreat of astrology and blew my mind. And I was like, oh, that's what it is. You know, because all I knew about it up to that point was, you know, the stuff in newspapers and magazines, you know, Mystic Meg predicting what'll happen to you today. And yeah, I mean, literally in this hour, it just hit me, and I was like, oh, and I was obsessed from that minute. You know, I went away and the next few weeks just reading everything I could find, ordering books. And probably within a few weeks, something in me was like, oh, this is it. This is my thing. And I wasn't looking for a thing. I never expected to find one. But it was like, I don't know what this means, but I have to study this. It was just a very deep calling, I suppose you'd say. Mm-hmm. And I've pretty much been studying and practicing, giving readings, teachings, and still learning myself for the last 10 years.
Mm. So the initial interest in plant medicine was, you said, just kind of a general unhappiness, or do you think there was something else you were looking for or searching for?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a bit of both, of being unhappy, repressed, really uncomfortable with myself, and this part of me that had this constant spiritual curiosity, even though, I mean, it's such a weird thing, and I still feel it now. I'm still a skeptic about most things, but I'm more of an open-minded skeptic. But yeah, there was this curiosity to know, is there something more than this physical 3D material world, while at the same time another part of me completely refusing to believe that's possible.
Mm-hmm. So when you went down to the jungle, you were working with ayahuasca predominantly, or other plants as well?
Ayahuasca and doing other plant diets.
Mm. And this was with mostly Shipibo or
no,
different?
it was Mestizo.
Mestizo.
So it was one of the big ayahuasca centers in the jungle. But yeah, the head maestro was from the Mestizo tradition.
Mm-hmm. And do you think plant medicine, was it just kind of a general progression that somehow opened you to this idea of astrology, or was there like one moment where something just clicked?
I mean, if there was a moment, it was that one when I sat in on that hour lecture. But I think it was more the case that, you know, at that point, 5-6 years of working with ayahuasca, I'd changed so much that something in me was ready for actually being able to take on board what this is, astrology. Mm-hmm. Whereas if I'd had that talk 5 years previously, it probably wouldn't have gone in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how would you describe astrology? Because I mean, I don't know that much about it. I do know a little. But as you said, I think there's a lot of misconceptions, and people have all sorts of different ideas of what that actually is.
Yeah. What is astrology? That's a big question. But ultimately, it's a language. So it's a language of symbols, signs, and omens that uses the position of the physical planets. But what's really important for me, that is often misunderstood, is that it's not a cause and effect relationship. So it's not like, oh, Saturn, the physical planet, is doing this to me. But it's a language, it's a descriptive language of what's going on. So it's like it describes all of the energies behind both our inner and outer world, actually. So events that happen in the world, but also our psychological makeup, our particular gifts, our challenges. You know, Carl Jung, I'm sure you've at least heard of, if not read lots about, very famous psychologist, psychiatrist. He was also an astrology practitioner, and he coined the phrase synchronicity, which essentially means an acausal connecting principle between two things. So there's a relationship between them, but one isn't causing the other. And, you know, that is, you could say, how astrology works, through synchronicity. Yeah, one analogy I like to use is a clock. So the hands on the clock tell the time, but the hands aren't causing the time. right? And so the same way astrology describes what's going on for us, but the planets aren't causing it. And so, we're not even really, in a way, we're not even really talking about the physical bodies, but more the archetypes. They all represent a particular archetype of this human experience. And so when you say the word Saturn, it's really a shorthand for the whole spectrum of possible ways that archetype can express.
I mean, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought of it that way, but I mean, I had read that Jung was also, if not an astrologer, very interested in astrology. And that's something he's also very well known for, is this idea of archetypes or myth or mythology, very much in the dream space. It seems like that's something we've kind of lost in modern day, is maybe these myths or these mythologies, and not necessarily, as you said, taking them to be literal, but there's something underneath them that they're actually trying to point to. So that's also for you a big part of astrology, is actually the archetype or the myth.
Yeah, and a lot of the planets, if not all of them, I'm not very well read or versed on myths, but that's, the stories of the gods, like Pluto in mythology was the lord of the underworld. That myth describes the archetype of the symbol of Pluto. Mm-hmm. So when that shows up in your chart, say you're having a Pluto transit, so Pluto as it is in the sky right now is connecting closely with something in your personal birth chart, you're going to experience the myth of Pluto. So realms of, going into your own personal underworld somehow. That can be experiences of grief or trauma or power struggles, control, but something Plutonian will happen in your life during such a time. And, ultimately for me, to kind of either continue or conclude what I was saying about what astrology is, for me, it's ultimately a divine guidance system for helping us navigate life. So it's not prediction, it's not what will happen to someone. I personally don't believe you can predict anything with any kind of accuracy. If you could, why even bother? Because it's going to happen anyway. But astrology isn't fated or deterministic, right? It's the position, the movements of the planets, you can know where they are and where they'll be at any point in time, but you don't know exactly how it will express. You know the themes. And so, when I do readings for people, the aim is to essentially help people understand what's going on, kind of like the wiring under the boards of their life, like what energies are behind either what events are happening or what they're feeling. And it's a tool for helping people move in harmony with what life wants for them. Mm-hmm. So what is life asking of you at this particular time? What's the best way to navigate this? In the very simplest black and white example, take action or allow. Mm-hmm. There's times for all different kinds of responses and ways of relating to life, and the astrology can help us understand what's best, what's most in harmony at any one time.
Are you familiar with some of the history of astrology? I mean, because it seems like it was actually something that was practiced all over the world, like Vedic astrology. Even how you described that reminded me, I don't know if I'm guessing there was a Chinese astrology too, but even the way you described that idea of taking action or rest, I mean, that seems like a very almost Chinese principle of, but obviously the Greeks practiced it. I know in Islam, they also practiced, and it was, I think in ancient times, also considered one of the sciences. It was actually the science of astrology.
Right. Yeah, I'm not that well versed in the history of astrology. But I know that some very ancient cultures like Mesopotamia and the Babylonians were some of the first to practice, I guess, kind of foundations of what, and astrology is always evolving, but it can be traced back. And yeah, I'm not very good with history, but what's that, maybe 5,000 years or more, those cultures, I think.
Yeah,
And
probably.
One thing that's really interesting as well is, it was developing in different places that had no contact with each other. And yet, more or less, the different cultures came up with the same archetypes, if you like, the same symbolism for the different planets. And, for me, I like to see it that essentially they were so well connected that it's like the planets, the stars, the astrology taught them what they were about. Because one way you can look at it is that astrology and the planets are spirits with which we can communicate. In the same way in this world and in plant medicine world, you communicate with other spirits. And, it reminds me of the story that I heard, whether true or not, I don't know, but of how people first started working with ayahuasca and putting, these leaves with this vine, how to know to combine it. And the story the maestro I worked with told was, well, the spirits told us, do this and do this, because they live in the jungle. They're so connected to the plants that, their cosmology, their worldview, their world understanding is so different to the West. And that's a normal part of it. So I like to imagine that that's how astrology first developed, by observing the movements and seeing what was going on Earth at that time and correlating the two.
Mm-hmm. So astrology, etymologically, it's essentially the study of stars, right?
Yeah, astro means star. What's ology? The study of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So why do you think that was so important for so many people? You mentioned this idea of archetype, but is it because the stars are universal? It's something that everyone has access to? For example, why not mountains or something else? What was it about the stars that was so important?
I have no idea. No, I could only speculate and speak off the top of my head. But maybe it's something about, because it's cycles, right? The moon moving around the earth around the sun, and all of the planets, it's all different cycles and time, and maybe there was a recognition of the cyclical nature of experience and life, and seeing how that correlated with the movement of the planets.
Mm-hmm. Well, it also seems like for these ancient cultures, like you mentioned, Babylon or, Sumer, Egypt, it seems like so much of the work they were doing, the structures they were building, were correlated to the movement of the stars.
Right.
And a lot of these things, like the pyramids, who knows how much effort that took, but a tremendous amount. And yet they were also correlated somehow to the movement of the stars. And so it seems like for all of these ancient people, there was something really, really profound about the stars. That they literally built these huge megalithic structures. Here where we are in Peru, very similar. All over the world, they seem to be correlated, as you said, to certain cycles or natural movements.
Yeah. And they were gods, weren't they? I think quite literally to people in ancient cultures. They build temples to worship the sun, worship the moon. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there must have been some kind of recognition of, that there's something more than the physical 3D world, that was a portal, perhaps a connection to other realms for them.
Mm-hmm.
I'm completely speculating. I have no idea about this.
Yeah. Well, something I've always found really fascinating is this idea of precession that, as you said, there's all these different movements, the moon around the earth around the sun. The earth, it rotates around itself, the 24 hours a day. It rotates around the sun 365 days a year, something like that. But it has a third orbit, which they call precession, and it's, something like 1 degree every 72 years.
Yeah, it's 26,000 years, I think, the
right.
full cycle.
Yeah, so 360 degrees at 72 years, something like 26,000 years. And yet that was something that all of these ancient cultures knew about. And that's fascinating too. I mean, because the average life today is, 78 years or something. So essentially, even if you started when you were born and you waited until you died, you would see a 1 degree change, which is, I would imagine, imperceivable, spread out over 72 years. And yet they knew that. They had mapped that. And that was a lot of, like, in Veda, they call it the yugas. And a lot of people are maybe familiar with, like, we're in Kali Yuga, and it's this interesting time.
Right.
I mean, but even that idea really blows my mind that, because they would divide that in by 12, like many things, which also seems very symbolic. And but so then each age was something like, 2,500 years or something. I mean, but just that scale is so vast. I mean, 26,000 years. I mean, we don't even date civilizations back to nearly that far, and yet they were talking about these cycles, and that actually humanity goes through these cycles, and each of these ages has a certain feel and quality to it. And something else I find really interesting is in the Vedas, which are kind of the oldest knowledge that's been transmitted. Towards the end of the Vedas, they, after expanding upon all of this knowledge and information, at the end they say, or so this is what the ancients told us. And it's like, but you are the ancients. But they're saying all of the knowledge that they're speaking about was given to them by someone even more ancient. So yeah, I find that really fascinating. One interesting thing, and again, I don't know if you know about this, when I started working with plants, and I had never really thought much about numerology or anything like that, but the number 11 kind of started presenting itself to me a lot. And again, I had no basis of, what is going on. But it just seemed way more than sheer probability. And this word you use, synchronicity, really resonated. And there's different theories about that. But one thing that I read interestingly recently, because it started with 11 and then also 33. And there's a YouTube channel I like by a guy named Robert Zephyr. And he was saying those two numbers are really significant because of astrology, because the difference between the lunar calendar and the solar calendar is 11 days a year. And so that number 11 is very significant because that's, again, the correlation between the lunar cycle and the solar cycle. And in Islam, he was saying, and he was even saying this translate all the way to like a lot of esoteric cults like Freemasons. Like in Freemasons, you have the 33rd degree, and that's the highest. And he was saying that the reason for that is actually because, again, if there's an 11-day gap every year, for it to come full cycle is 33 years, to where the calendars resync up again. And so that's why that number is so significant, because it's like the return, the one full cycle. So yeah, who knows? But I found that very interesting. So when you're working with astrology, does someone come to you with something, or I really have no idea how that works. So what are you doing, or what are you observing or calculating?
Yeah. Well, it depends. It reminds me of when I was learning astrology, and I'd always ask my teacher, does this mean this? And he's like, it depends. But essentially, what I like is somebody comes with certain questions. So sometimes people have a lot of knowledge of astrology, sometimes nothing, sometimes a little. But for whatever reason, they're like, oh, I feel like I should get a reading with you. And there's a reason why somebody wants to get a reading, and they may not even know it at the time. They may or they may not. But ideally, I have a starting point of context of what do you want to know. Because basically you've got, in a very small number of symbols, in effect, someone's entire life, possibilities, potentials, probabilities, and you can go in so many different directions with how you do a reading. And so it's important for me to have context of what do you want to know. And I may not necessarily have all the answers, but it's a starting point. So, usually a reading will consist of discussing the basic birth chart, so the moment you're born. And just to take a step back and say, so your chart is from the place, time, and date of your birth. And so it's like, when you look at a chart, it's a pictorial view of the heavens from the place you were born at the moment you were born. And so, actually, I'm going to go off on quite a tangent now, but I think it's worth it.
Yeah, by all means.
So, it's subjective, right? And this really goes into the nature of what astrology is and how it works. So, it's your subjective view of the heavens. And so astrology is geocentric, right? Meaning the Earth is at the center and everything else, including the sun, revolves around the chart. Now, we know in science now the solar system is heliocentric, right? Everything revolves around the sun. But there's a really important distinction between what you could call the objective heliocentric model and subjective geocentric, in that astrology doesn't describe what you could call objective reality. It describes your personal subjective experience of life. So your gifts, your challenges, the kind of experiences that you're likely to have. It's very personal. And so it's not objective science in the sense of describing the world out there. It's describing your world, almost like the filter or the lens through which you experience life. And so that's kind of symbolized in the fact that a chart is geocentric. It's like I'm at the middle, the sun, or a sort of more objective worldview isn't in astrology at the center. And so there's this kind of ties into people trying to explain science, explain astrology through science as we understand it now. So doing statistical modeling on it, looking for, similar factors. And it never works. And for the scientists, that's proof that astrology is nonsense. Whereas all it really proves is astrology doesn't fit into the model of the scientific understanding as we currently have it of how life works. So in a way, you could say science is within astrology, because astrology is it describes, doesn't explain, but it describes the entirety of one's personal universe in some way. And so within the human experience, science is one way of understanding. And it's not to dismiss it, you want to build a bridge, you go to an engineer. But if you want to understand something about the deeper nature of consciousness and one's life, astrology is a better tool than objective science. There's probably more I want to say on that, but what was your original question? Or what happens in a reading?
Yeah.
So basically what I'm doing is describing a person's subjective reality. And so, by the way, before astrology, I kind of had the view that either everyone sees life the same way I do, or if they don't, they should. And astrology really helped me see, wow, they're not just being, obstinate or argumentative, they actually see things differently. And so a chart kind of describes our perceptive reality, how we see the world, how we operate, what matters to us, what's important, what isn't, and like I say, our gifts and our challenges. So all these kinds of things I will describe in a reading. And what's also really important to say is, it's not like, say, a psychic reading where you can look at a chart and know everything about a person. I can see, it's like I have the knowledge of the symbols and possibilities and probabilities of how they might be expressed. But any sort of configuration in a chart can have so many worldly expressions, all related to the same underlying archetype. And so I see readings as a collaboration. I bring the knowledge of the symbolism, the person brings the knowledge of themselves and their life. And so it's like together we see exactly what it means for them. So I can say, there might be, for example, 5 possible things I see around something in a chart. And I might mention them all, and maybe 2 or 3 really resonate with the person and the others don't. And that's fine. For me, it's not like trying to prove, like almost like a mind read or tell you all about your life, but rather, what of this is important, and then from that we can kind of go deeper into the specifics. So a reading's generally a mix of that, the key life themes, and what's going on at this current time, and as I said before, what is life asking of us at this time. So essentially I see astrology, and I guess life as well, because astrology is for me the best language for describing life, our own personal life and kind of the global happenings. And so I've completely forgotten what I was going to say now.
It's a really good language for understanding life.
Yeah, what was I saying just before that?
One thing I find interesting, because you were saying, yes, I guess at a certain time, definitely at a certain time, many people believed the sun rotated around the earth, and then it was seen that the earth rotates around the sun. Or some people even say they're in a symbiotic rotation. But why would that discredit anything? Because again, if we're saying, I'm born at this place at this time, it's completely self-centric in a way. So it shouldn't, wouldn't seem like that would matter whether the earth is rotating around the sun or the sun around the earth, because it's saying this is the position of the stars at this particular moment in time from right here. So I don't know, to me that would almost seem irrelevant.
Yeah, not to the scientists.
No.
It's one of the many arguments they have of, well, this can't be true because astrology says in a chart the sun rotates around the earth. We know that doesn't happen anymore, so this is old superstition. Or, as you brought up, the precession of the equinoxes, the constellations in Western astrology that we use because of the precession of the equinoxes no longer line up with the physical stars, is also proof to them that astrology is outdated superstition. What they don't understand is, that's not what astrology is saying. And it's a really interesting kind of topic of the difference between the tropical zodiac and the sidereal zodiac. So Vedic astrology uses the sidereal zodiac. So it moves with the precession of the equinoxes.
And what is sidereal?
Sidereal means of the stars.
Okay.
So it means that the zodiac, the chart that they use in Vedic astrology, lines up with where the actual stars are in the sky right now. And, they move slowly over those thousands of years. Whereas Western astrology uses the tropical zodiac, which means that 0 degree Aries always falls kind of not necessarily on the same day, but within the same 24-hour period. It's the start of the astrological year, 20th or 21st of March. And the reason that Western astrology uses this zodiac and doesn't move with the slow movement of the stars over thousands of years is because it's linked to the tropics. So that is the tropic of Cancer, the Tropic of Capricorn being lines of latitude on the Earth 23.5 degrees north and south, which denote the movement of the sun. Going back to my 15-year-old geography lessons, but it's the sun is overhead between those 2 points throughout the year, right? So on the solstices, the sun is on the summer solstice in the northern hemisphere, the sun is on the line of the Tropic of Cancer, meaning it's directly overhead, 23.5 degrees north, right? And in December, Tropic of Capricorn. And in the middle, on the equinoxes, right on the equator. And so it's this movement that the zodiac follows. So it's called the tropical zodiac. It's linked to the tropics. So it's linked to the sun's migration relative to the Earth, north and south of the equator. And so you have the Tropic of Cancer that begins when the sun is overhead the Tropic of Cancer on the 21st of June. That begins the sign of Cancer. And so what it's doing is basically where the constellations were 2 or 3 or however many thousand years ago when Western astrology first developed, the Tropic of Cancer lined up with the sign of, the movement, the dates in our calendar, so June, the start of Cancer, lined up with the physical constellation Cancer. But it was never really about the stars. It was kind of I suppose you'd say like a handy guidance system, but it's about the cycles on Earth, because we're living on Earth, we're not living in the stars. Well, some people I know are. But, and so the fact that over these thousands of years, the equinoxes, the signs are precessed, doesn't actually matter, because it's still, Cancer begins on the 21st of June, because the sun is at that point relative to Earth. Does that make sense? I don't know if I explained that clearly enough. Yeah. But basically to say that the position of the stars, the constellations, was a signpost, a handy tool. But those constellations in the sky don't carry certain qualities. It's just they were there, and that constellation was associated with certain experiences and realms here on Earth.
Mm-hmm. So it's not, for example, we know the moon has a very direct effect on the Earth. I mean, waves and all sorts of things. So, but with astrology, it's not inherently that a certain planet has a physical effect, but it's more of the archetype of what's going on in that moment in time.
A lot of astrologers would say the former. I wouldn't. But that for me is kind of, it's kind of predicated on a cause and effect model. Whereas I don't see astrology like that. I don't see, that the planets, in a way it's kind of irrelevant. Actually, it's like, what matters? Does this help you in your life? But I don't see it that it's actually physically having an effect. Maybe it is in ways that we haven't yet to discover. But I always go back to astrology being a science in the old sense, not a science in the new sense. More like an art, a mystical art of signs and omens and guidance. That's how I relate to it, as kind of being a translator of the signs, omens, guidance from the divine, from spirits, down to earth. And so, yeah, it's like translating those symbols into English for a client or for myself in my own life. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of the middleman.
Mm-hmm. I was born in Sri Lanka, and when I was born, my parents took me to an astrologer because it was a very common practice, and they map based on obviously the location, the time, the date. And I was reading even in India, there was a case, because in India it's still practiced as a science, as one of the many sciences, and there was a case to actually make it not a science, but whatever, their court system or whatever ruled against that, so it still is. So there's a long history, especially in India, Sri Lanka, these areas of that practice. So what is the idea? I mean, obviously, the moment you're born, the stars are in a very unique place. So what is it about that unique moment in time that affects someone's being, what you can then say based off of that?
I guess the best way I can conceive of that is in any particular moment in time, there's a particular energetic configuration of, on the planet, in a sense, anywhere in the world. And so I don't know if it's literally like this, but maybe one way to visualize it is it's like that moment you're born, you're imprinted with that configuration. So the energies, the archetypes, the planetary symbols are in certain places, and they are going to describe not cause, particular key themes to happen in your life. One of the things that I guess is fascinating about astrology that I didn't like for a long time, but I'm okay with now, is the questions of how and why. I don't know that we can really ever answer that. It's more like try it out for yourself and see. And if it works, you don't have to know how it works. It's for me, looking at a chart, it's kind of like looking into the mind of God. I sometimes look at it like that, and I don't know how it works. It blows my mind all the time. But I'm coming from a ardent skeptic. Experience has shown me that it does work, and that's what matters. So, it's good to recognize that astrology is not a belief system, but rather you experiment, you look into it for yourself, and then decide for yourself whether or not it works. Even if you can't explain why, does your experience bear out what you understand, what astrology says? And there's an amazing book by a guy called Richard Tarnas, who's kind of an academic and a historian and was an astrology skeptic. But unlike pretty much any other astrology skeptic in history, he actually decided to study it. And he wrote this big book called Cosmos and Psyche. And it basically details kind of how it blew his mind and changed. The subtitle of the book is Intimations of a New Worldview. So it describes how it completely changed his understanding of life and how it works through the archetypal lens of astrology. And most of the book, hundreds of pages, is filled with, because he's a historian, countless examples from history of what was going on at the time in the world, key world events, and the main astrological configurations of the time. And so he describes the natures of the different archetypes at the beginning, and then just goes through countless examples of how these, say, Saturn and Uranus coming together, and 50 ways in which that was expressed in the world. And so you can't prove astrology through statistical probability type models. But if you understand it and experiment and explore it for yourself, it has the potential to change the entire way you see the world, rather than looking to objective science to help understand it. And actually, I've got quite a cool Carl Jung story that, if you want to hear it, kind of gives a flavor of the nature of astrology. So he was, as I mentioned before, very into astrology. It was actually part of what led to his split with Freud, because Jung had this kind of inner battle between his mystical self and his kind of, the more Freudian way of viewing things. And it was as he started embracing the mystical more, it kind of led to a lot of conflict with Freud. But he did this experiment one time. So there are 3 factors in a chart that are sometimes said to denote a cosmic marriage. Okay, so this is where you're comparing 2 people's charts, usually in a romantic relationship. And basically you have these 3 possible ways. So you have the sun of one person on top of the moon of the other person, meaning, they're both in the same sign of the zodiac, very close to each other. So technically that's called sun conjunct moon, on right next to. Or you could have moon conjunct moon, or you could have moon conjunct ascendant. So 3 ways in which this really strong factor he called a cosmic marriage, basically denoting very strong compatibility, can show up. And he decided to do some hardcore mainstream science statistics research on it. So he had 3 female assistants, and basically between them they got, I don't know how many hundreds of couples charts to see if there was any statistical significance in any of these factors between husband and wife. And so, his 3 assistants each divided up the all of the charts that they were looking at and collated them for Jung. And then he analyzed the data. And what he found was, when he looked at the first pile from the first assistant had got statistically significant sun conjunct moon. So one of the factors showed up, but not the other 2. In the second pile, moon conjunct moon. So the second factor showed up, but not the other 2. And in the third pile, moon conjunct ascendant. So in each of the 3 piles, statistically significant, each one of the factors, but when you put them all together, no correlation, no significance at all. And then Freud looked at the charts of his assistants.
Freud or Jung?
Jung.
Jung.
Then Jung looked at the charts of his assistants, and in the first pile that had statistically significant sun-moon correlation, his assistant and her husband had sun-moon correlation between their charts. So this pile reflected her symbolism with her husband. In the second pile, same thing, moon and moon in the pile of charts. The assistant and her husband had moon conjunct moon. And same thing in the third pile. Basically showing how you can't take yourself out of the equation with astrology. So it's like something of the nature of the people involved influenced or was a factor in somehow what showed up. So each taken separately, you've got statistically significant correlations, altogether meaningless information. And so when people have done these big studies of astrology, objective statistical analysis, almost exclusively meaningless. Because astrology is about the specific and it's about the subjective. So it works in the context that you're doing it with a particular person, but you can't expand that out and say anything meaningful on the bigger scale. Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
So all of these archetypes, you were saying, for example, like Saturn has an archetype. And in these different traditions, do they have similar archetypes, or it's really dependent upon the tradition you're learning from?
What I don't know pretty much anything about is Vedic astrology. So I don't know how it differs in that. I don't even know if they use the outer planets in Vedic astrology. But in terms of what you could call the different branches of Western astrology, pretty much all mean the same thing. Yeah, and, you know, there's different ways of working with them. And that's also, I suppose, an interesting thing about astrology is no two astrologers will do astrology the same because you're different, right? So it's like you have to learn the rules, learn the formula, and then find your own way with it. But you have to kind of learn the mainstream first. But, you know, I'm a very analytical, logical, rational Virgo. So when I was learning, it was like, I read one book and this means this. And I'm like, okay, good. And then I read something else and it says something different. And I'm like, well, which is right? And that's kind of the art and the challenge of practicing it is there's not like a formula, you know, it's not like, you know, transiting Saturn on top of your sun equals this. You can describe the similarities and possibilities, but there's so many different expressions of it. And so, yeah, I don't know where I was going with that, but to answer your actual question, yes, there is widespread agreement on the nature of what these planets symbolize. And what's really cool as well is how, so traditional astrology was basically up to Saturn, right? Until the 1800s, we didn't know there were any other planets. And it was 1781, Uranus was discovered. Neptune was, God, when was Neptune? 1800 and something, it escapes me. And then Pluto was 1930. And what's really interesting is how what was going on in the world at that time was really descriptive of what was come to see the natures, the archetypes of these new planets. So, you know, to give you the example of Uranus, Uranus is known as the liberator, the awakener. It's the rebel, the revolutionary. You have a Uranus transit and it's like revolution, not evolution in your life. It's like sudden changes, unexpected kind of chaos and disruption. And you had at that time, you know, the latter half of the 1700s, you had the Industrial Revolution, you had the French Revolution, you had the American War of Independence. So it was like all this revolutionary energy was kind of coming up on Earth at that time, and synchronistically Uranus was discovered then. So it's not like the discovery of Uranus caused it, but the discovery of it was reflective of kind of the new energy coming to humanity at that time.
It's interesting too, because even, I mean, if we're talking about it in a more Western sense, I mean, even, you know, when the West discovered certain things, or even the idea of the Earth rotating around the sun. I mean, there was older cultures that actually had said that far previous to that. I mean, I think even in Sumeria or Sumer, they found a stone tablet which actually depicts the solar system more or less how it is.
With the outer planets?
With the outer planets as well. It might have been one off. Maybe there was like 10 or 8. I can't remember exactly, but essentially...
I mean, there's a lot of evidence, isn't there, these days for our understanding of human history to be way off. That, you know, who knows how many tens, hundreds of thousands of years civilizations more advanced than today existing. But there's a lot of anomalies in the history as it's understood right now. So why not? You know, when we talk about, I guess what I'm saying now is just at the last few thousand years, but who knows actually what was going on 100,000 years ago.
Do you think that could be some of the maybe discrepancy too? Is like many things, maybe certain things were lost, and then it's just taken time to actually be able to re-understand these things. I mean, because like you see that here in Peru, from my perspective, I would imagine, you know, places like Inti Raymi or Machu Picchu probably were not built by the Incas. Because if you look at Inca architecture, it's much more primitive. And that's somehow much more advanced. And by most people's estimates, much older. Similar to in Egypt, the older pyramids were more technologically advanced. So it seems like, you know, a lot of people... There's this great flood theory that, you know, asteroidal impact, something happened and it kind of reset humanity. And then it's like we try and rediscover the past. It's like we have that memory of things, but how do we get there? And we very well could have lost a lot of that technology. So,
I'm totally open to that possibility. I'm sure that there was a lot more going on in the past here than is commonly understood. I don't know what or when or who, but why not?
Yeah.
You know, if I learn anything the older I get, it's how little I know.
So these archetypes, where do you think those came from? Was it some wise guy a long time ago who just had a download, or do you think it was like pattern recognition that they started seeing, oh, like this planet is there, this is what's happening, this must mean that?
Yeah, again, I actually don't know. Whether it's common knowledge in the history of astrology or not, I'm not sure. I kind of never... I'm such a, like, practical, earthy person that I'm like, well, what does it mean and how do I use it? And so I haven't really looked into, you know, where it all came from and how it developed. So I'd be speculating. I think that there's probably, I would guess, you know, observation of the movements of the planets and certain experiences that people were having. And, you know, it must have been a lot of people over a long time doing that to have kind of a catalogue and build up an understanding of these archetypes, and or like full-on kind of spiritual downloads, connecting to the spirit of the planet and essentially having direct communication with them. Maybe that too.
I mean, I think that's certainly something when people begin to work with some of these plants, especially something like ayahuasca. I think to someone maybe who hasn't done that may sound very strange, but maybe someone who has really gone into that doesn't seem that foreign, that there are just potentially these downloads of information, of revelation even.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah. So you said you studied with a teacher. Maybe can you talk about that? Like, where did he learn the craft, and what was that process like of learning the craft yourself?
So I guess I've studied with a few different teachers since I began, but most of them from the same school. And so there's an amazing English guy called Dr. Geoffrey Cornelius, who he has a very small now organization in Britain called the Company of Astrologers. And so the first person to introduce me to astrology had studied with him. I then have since studied with other people who studied with him, as well as a bit with Geoffrey directly. And he's just one of these rare breeds where basically he was studying directly the ancient texts. So I don't know that he even had a teacher himself, but he studied directly one very famous English astrologer from the 1600s called William Lilly, who's kind of seen as the, maybe the greatest astrologer that's ever lived. And I don't know the details of Geoffrey's background, but he's well versed in astrology, in forms of divination like the I Ching. He kind of knows everything. He's also a lecturer in like divination and myth, and I forget the nature of the name of the course now, but he's steeped in this kind of mystical, mythological, divinatory understanding of life. And so he was kind of single-handedly he was one of the main people responsible in the 1970s for bringing back this very ancient form of astrology called horary astrology, which essentially is astrology as divination. Divination meaning communing with spirits. And so, as a side note, many astrologers today, especially quite well-known ones, are very scientific in their understanding, almost like it's this cosmic clockwork. The planet moves here, this happens to you. And Geoffrey is quite radical, really, in kind of breaking away from that worldview and having it as this kind of mystical, divinatory, spiritual art. And one thing I studied with him was this horary astrology, which is, it kind of blows the whole scientific notions out of the water, because you're not even using a birth chart. It's when you have a very specific, important question in your life, you ask the question, and the moment the question's asked, at the place it was asked, you draw up that chart. And not always, but usually when it's an important question, the position of the planets will describe precisely your situation and show you basically what's the best thing to do in that situation, and if you do that, how things will turn out. So it's a very it's the most complex and the most interesting and fun form of astrology, and it's said to be a test of your desire. So you ask a horary question, and it's like, so I don't know, is it right for me? This was a question I asked a couple of years ago. Should I move to Peru? Is that the right thing for me? And you don't just get a yes-no answer, but all of the background detail shown in the symbolism by the planets and the signs of what has been happening, what is happening, what will happen. And so the word desire comes from the Latin desideri, which means of the stars, which is another way of saying, the word stars back in the day was really kind of spirit or God, kind of a synonym. So when you're asking a horary question, you're saying, is this my true desire? Is this divine will? And is this in my deepest interest? And it's one and the same. And then your free will, when you get the answer, is to follow it or not. Because very often it doesn't necessarily point to the easiest path, but it's like, this is my true desire, my soul's desire. Which also reminds me, and I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I love etymology, right? So you got desire. Two other really common words that are associated with astrology. One is consider, and the other is disaster. Any thoughts on what they mean in relation to astrology?
Not really. I mean, I'm also really interested in etymology, and often I find it fascinating because often the roots of these words have very different meanings from what we think.
So different, and so much knowledge in the real meanings. Yeah. So consider means with the stars. Sider, sidereal is Latin for the stars. Con is with. So when you consider something, what you're really, or what you used to be doing, is like, again, is this in alignment with the stars, which is another way of saying, is this divine will, is this in my deepest interest? And disaster, disastro, is to go against the stars. It's always like bad star or against the star. And so, yeah, if you have a disaster, I mean, I guess you could look at it as like, either it's not like the stars aren't lining up for you right now, like it's not the right time, or you've taken an action against what the symbolic language of astrology is showing is the right course of action for you.
That's fascinating.
It's pretty cool.
I mean, that's seen in a lot of spiritual traditions. I mean, even this idea of presence or reality. Am I fighting against reality? Am I flowing with what's happening with the present moment, or am I fighting against that? Yeah. So, what was that like? Was there your training? There was something specific you had to do, or it was just study? It was kind of memorizing these archetypes, or really trying to understand what they were pointing towards?
Yeah, so in the beginning, it was very much kind of very, you could say, rote learning. Like the first person I studied with was actually a correspondence course, and very in-depth, but, you get just reams of information. This sign means this sign means this, and this planet means this. And so at first, yeah, just learning kind of almost like lists of facts. But then I guess the true learning, what takes you beyond being able to just parrot what a book says and be an astrologer is, it's, for me, it's an art. It's not, I don't really see it as a science, at least in the way we understand it now, but it's an art of interpretation. And so it's, okay, I've got all these facts, but basically then it was practicing, doing readings, looking at my own chart. How does this stack up? What was happening at this time? And looking at friends' charts and just starting to do readings for free. And, it's like, maybe like anything, really, you can only learn by doing. And so, step one is get the basic information down, but then only by constantly doing charts and talking to people what was happening when this was going on, it's kind of like you start to build up your own repertoire of experience. So somebody has their sun next to Pluto in their chart, and you get to hear 10 different versions of what that's like. And so it's almost like it, the information just kind of seeps in. And, there's most of my study now and for a while has been looking at charts with my teachers. So it's like, here's this chart, they've got this thing going on in their life. I see this, but, you know, is this how you see it? What am I missing? And so a lot of mostly experience and practice. But, you know, at least the first 2 years or so was a lot of just reading more factual information, if you like, about... Because, you know, when I began, I had no idea what the archetype of Pluto was about. I didn't know anything about the myth, so you read and read and read and read books. I think for about 6 years, I never read anything other than astrology books.
Mm-hmm. I mean, also, there's something from my perspective that seems very scientific about that. I mean, pattern recognition, observing the past, seeing how that correlates to the present, using that to predict the future. I mean, but there's so many things like that. I mean, even here, there's people who can tell when it's going to rain. And a lot of people would be like, well, that's not scientific at all. Where are you getting that from? And I sense. But then maybe when we look into that, we see, well, there is some scientific basis behind that. Maybe they smell that there's a certain peatiness that comes out of the soil that they correlate to rain, or they hear a bird that they know through pattern recognition when that bird acts a certain way, this is going to happen.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I guess when I use the word science, it's mostly in terms of kind of current mainstream understanding of how the world works. Astrology doesn't fit into that. But who knows, in 10, 100, 1,000 years, when as a culture we understand life differently as a collective, it would be part of mainstream science. And, you know, I guess it was in the past, and as you say, still is in India today, considered a science.
Well, even from there's a guy who wrote a book, Robert Boval. I think maybe it's called The Orion Mystery, and his theory is that the pyramids of Egypt are actually correlated to Orion's belt, and the Great Sphinx, which has been shown now by a guy named, I think, Robert Schoch. You know, from basically anyone who doesn't have a foot in the game, it's quite obvious that the body is much bigger than the head. The weathering patterns on the body are much older than the weathering patterns on the head, which is even more strange because I think when Napoleon found, or, you know, when he discovered for him the Sphinx, it was actually buried under sand, and so only the head was exposed. So if anything, the head should have much older weathering patterns, or much greater weathering patterns. So almost assuredly, the head was carved by a pharaoh much later, and nobody knows for sure what the head was, but most likely either a lion, because it's the body of a lion, so the head of a lion. Some people say maybe like a jackal. It could be the body of some sort of dog, but I think most people would say a lion. And it's interesting because a lot of people discredited that theory because the three pyramids are not quite aligned with Orion. So they said, oh, well, either they're off or maybe they were, but they were just kind of primitive. But again, if you take into account precession and you actually figure when those would have been exactly lined up, and the lion exactly lined up with I don't know what the astrological term is, but the rising of the constellation of Leo, there's a point in time where they're exactly lined up. But that's often dismissed because I think it was something like either 11,000 years ago or another precessional cycle would have been 36,000 years ago. And both of those, by mainstream Egyptologists, are considered blasphemy because that's way before.
It doesn't fit with their timeline and story of...
Right. And one of the reasons they always said that was, well, if there are... And it's also fascinating. There's another guy who I find really fascinating. His name, he just passed recently. His name is John Anthony West. But he was saying that also somewhere in Egypt on one of the, it wasn't in the Great Pyramid, but somewhere else, there was engravings of all of the different Egyptian kings. And according to themselves, if you date back all that lineage of kings, they dated back to something like 35,000 years ago, which is quite interesting too. But one of the arguments Egyptologists would always say is, well, if this is that old, where's the evidence of other older civilizations like that? And there never was. But now things are coming out, things like Göbekli Tepe and Gunung Padang, I think, in modern-day Pakistan. But it seems like that the more that we're actually looking, the more these older civilizations are coming out. But I just find that so fascinating that, I mean, these massive structures that we have still today no idea what they are. But I mean, again, the effort to put into that,
or how they built them.
I mean, there's different theories now, but nobody is certain that even today we could build them.
I heard a good theory from a shaman friend of mine. He was at, is it Tiwanaku in Bolivia, one of the big sacred sites? And the visual he got, the image he got of these, like how they moved these giant stones was, there was these priests playing music. And the resonance of the music, the stones levitated and moved themselves into place. Yeah. And, these days I'm like, yeah, why not? I have no idea. But it's as good an explanation. Current science can't explain how they possibly move these stones, cut them with laser-like precision.
Well, and certainly not with the tools that we would have accredited them.
Exactly. Yeah.
Essentially stones and copper instruments.
Right. It's impossible.
But for me, it's just so fascinating that these massive structures were directly correlated to the stars.
Yeah.
And they think even the shafts in there are correlated to, maybe it's Sirius or the Pleiades, which is also super fascinating because that's something that's seen in many places in the world. Even a Colombian guy who I work with, I mean, in the depths of the Amazon, their oral history is that they came from Sirius, they came from the Pleiades, and that's something it's you find in various places of the world.
So idea I hear a lot about these days from various factions.
Yeah. So, and again, this idea of the great year, the 26,000s, and all of the ages in between them, they were always broken up into 12 cycles. Do you have any idea why that number was significant? I mean, also talking about myth, I mean, you see it all over the world, the 12 disciples of Jesus, 12 months.
Let's see if I can remember and verbalize this. I did know this once. So the 12 is... oh man, I might have to get back to you on this. I was just a few weeks ago thinking about this and I had it all clear in my mind. But it's to do, 12 is a solar number. It's to do with the sun. Like 13 is the moon. Why and how to explain it, that might have to be for next time.
Yeah.
But I'm going to go and look it up because it was like, when I was reading about this, I was like, oh yeah, it all makes total sense. And yeah, there's a good answer to your question, but I don't have it right now.
Yeah. So what would you say are common things that people come to you for?
I mean, almost always tell me about my career and my love life. Those are like universal. If I say, have you got any particular questions, area of interest, 95% of the time it's those two. Which makes sense, two of the most important things. Sometimes it's different, very specific things. But most often, what people come for is And what I like to give people is a different perspective on themselves and their lives. If something in particular is happening, like for example, a while ago I did a reading for someone, and so I saw in her astrology chart where Pluto was. It was in a really significant place connected with home, and also, because what's interesting about a chart is it shows the same areas of the chart has an external and an internal expression. So the inside and the outside of our lives are shown by the same symbols. And so where Pluto was pointed to her home and like big emotional challenges coming, but it's also connected to a physical house. And so she was like, oh, I've been having all sorts of problems with my house. And I said, is it water related? Is it the plumbing? And she was like, oh my God, like 5 different occasions, water leaks, issues with it. And so that was very clearly shown by Pluto, but that was also pointing to basically Pluto, the underworld, deeply repressed emotions starting to break up out into the surface. And, I don't know much about Jung, but I know he talked about how, was it the anima and the animus, how unexpressed parts of energies within us physically materialize in the world. And so you can see that through astrology. So all the water plumbing leaks kind of directed us to what's going on an emotional level right now. What's coming up? What are you pushing away? Because it's like, in a way, that's why you're having leaks in your house. It's kind of, you could see it as an omen, a sign from life, from spirit, to there's something you need to look at within. So that's one kind of specific example. But yeah, often, the main things are like, what are my main gifts? What are my main challenges? What am I here to do in the world? And so it's never my place to say, oh, you should be a policeman or a doctor. But what I can do is describe the underlying, the kind of connection, the kinds of things that the person would be suited to. And, often I would offer 4, 5, 6 possibilities as like, which of these, if any, fit. And usually 1 or 2 is like, oh yeah, that. So yeah, it's never my place, and I wouldn't want to ever tell someone what to do. They wouldn't listen to me anyway, but, it's like helping a person. It's like reflecting where they're at, what's going on. And very often it's just confirmation. Anyone who has any semblance of self-awareness, a lot of what I say doesn't come as a surprise, but it seems to be, from my client's experience, extremely affirming and helpful, because it helps them understand from a different perspective what's happening and, be like, oh, okay, I'm right. It gives them the confidence to move forwards with what they were thinking of, but it's like, is this crazy? Am I completely doing the wrong thing? Sometimes people are, but more often than not, they're not. But it gives that affirmation of where they're at, what they're experiencing. And, sometimes it's, and, I use it like this for myself sometimes. Sometimes it's just a great confirmation of this is what's supposed to be happening right now. Even if it's looks like a mess, nothing's working out as it should, the symbolism describes that, so you haven't done it wrong. You haven't got it wrong. This is the experience life wants you to have right now. And even just something as simple as that can be quite helpful, rather than, this constant, what am I doing wrong? Why? This is like, no, it sucks, but this is right for right now. And in 6 months, 8 months, whatever, it will have passed. So you can also provide reassurance that what's going on now has an ending.
That's a really interesting point. I never thought about that. But I mean, even so much of my work working with plants, it's very similar. So much is just confirmation, reassurance. I mean, in a ceremony, just telling someone like it is okay, and that's not coming from a blind place. It's coming from a place of experience. Like, oh yeah, I've seen this. Like, I understand where you are, and it's going to be okay. Like, this will pass. You will get out of this. I understand. Like, maybe I do, maybe I don't, but often maybe I understand what's happening right now, and that's actually good. That's a really important part of the process. Also, when you were talking, it reminded me, I think for a long time in our more maybe Western medical way of looking at things, we just looked at things in a very cause and effect relationship. You have this chronic ailment, and it's just because this chemical is not what it needs to be, something like that. But I think certainly the more we learn, we see that there are certain pattern recognitions. Certainly working with plants, working with so many people, that's definitely, I've seen that a lot. I mean, there are conditions where one can see certain patterns in one's past that there's a very high probability that correlates to that illness that they're suffering from, whether it's, childhood trauma or certain belief systems, certain patterns, ways of looking at the world. And then there's this manifestation of an illness. So that's interesting, saying that sometimes just recognizing that can be very healing, because I definitely resonate with that.
And also, one additional thing to that is, if I can, not necessarily knowing all the specifics, but I can sit there, and if I can tell a person the kinds of life experiences they've had when they've had these big experiences, what it felt like, how it changed them, again, without necessarily knowing the specifics of it, but that seems to have a tremendous power of just someone gets me. It's I suppose, again, an affirmation or a confirmation of what I've been through, the experiences I've had, who I am. It's someone sees me. So that's pretty cool to be able to provide that for people.
I mean, that can be huge. I remember reading an article a couple of years ago, and they had tried all of these different pharmaceuticals on people who had obesity, and there was a certain success rate, but it was relatively low. And then they started this thing where their doctor simply asked them about their past. Seemingly that would be something quite obvious, but it wasn't happening. And simply that one question and them beginning to open up and actually talk about their past outperformed the pharmaceuticals by manyfold. And that's an example too, where I think from my experience, from a lot of people's experience, often obesity is kind of, it's a covering of the past. Often there's something that happened in someone's life, and it could be sexual or some sort of trauma, and the weight is almost this protective mechanism that someone is putting on, because then they don't get that attention that may have been the very thing that traumatized them. So yeah, that's really interesting. So if someone's working with you, is it more like a one-off thing where someone comes to you and they have some sort of reassurance, or is it something where people tend to come back and work on different things? They're trying to learn more about themselves?
For the most part, most people probably most people have one reading and they're happy with that. But a good number will come back periodically. So, once every 12 months is a good time, or once every 6 months. Or where something specific comes up and it's like, quick session to talk about a specific thing. So I suppose a good number of my clients I would probably see annually. There's different kinds of astrologers that are more, that have also a therapy background, who will use the chart as a basis, but then it becomes kind of a more regular therapeutic process. That's not really my style. I don't have that kind of training. So, it would be on a pretty infrequent basis. Frequent might be someone comes like 3-4 times in a year. But even that would be the exception, once, twice a year.
And when they're coming, you're always using their birth chart, or you're also using the moment kind of chart you described?
Yeah, so it depends what they want to know. So if they come with, like one of the kinds of readings I offer is the horary, where you have this very specific question, is this the right move? It could be like anything from, should I sue this person? Will I win the court case? Kind of anything, as long as it's important. So that's its kind of standalone thing. Then you don't need the birth chart. Then you just look at that chart, one-off session. Otherwise, a standard normal, most of the readings will be, you always have the birth chart. That's like the foundation, the bedrock. And in subsequent readings, you would look more about what's going on at this current time relative to that person's birth chart. So everything that happens in relation to the birth chart. But, later readings would more focus on this time and what. The birth chart's like latent potential. It's these themes waiting to be activated. And as the planets move, they activate them, and then that thing is up. So, you might, in subsequent readings, focus on just one or two very specific parts of their chart and themes and issues, whereas an initial reading would be generally a bit broader in scope.
Mm-hmm. So when people are reading the newspaper on Sunday, and there's the astrological, whatever you call that, the readings, is that just a really simplified version because they're just taking essentially the sun sign and trying to generalize things on that?
Yeah, this is one of the unfortunate things about astrology, because other kind of divinatory or mystical arts aren't in the mainstream generally, but astrology, everyone's like, oh, I know astrology, I read my column every week. And basically what they're doing is they're basing it on your sun sign. So you might get, I guess there's different lengths, but you get a paragraph speaking to 1/12 of the entire population. And it's interesting. I never read them. I'm not really a fan of that kind of thing. Doesn't work for me. But I know a lot of very good astrologers, genuine astrologers, who also write those columns. So they're not just written by people who don't know what they're talking about. It is, I see it as kind of light entertainment in a way, but there is still, some truth in there. I guess it's more like you have to take what's usually quite a general paragraph or statements and work with it yourself. So is there validity to them? I personally wouldn't read them. But I was a bit surprised to learn that actual genuine proper astrologers write most of those. But it's also, astrology is not, if you want to become rich, astrology is not necessarily the best path. So it's also, fair enough, you got to make some money, you got to pay the bills. These big publications will pay you to write something that isn't just totally pulled out of thin air. There's some relevance to the movements of the planets, but by nature it can only be quite general and vague.
Yeah. Yeah, well, cool. Anything else you can think of with astrology that the audience may be interested in learning?
Not off the top of my head. I think that's there's so much you can do with astrology that it's kind of hard to encapsulate, but maybe just to briefly mention a couple of other ways you can work with it. So you've got like the standard birth chart, key themes in a life. You've got transits and other timing measures to what's going on at this time. You can also use, and you've got the specific questions, so horary, divination. You can also, what's a really cool thing to use astrology for is you're going to start something new of importance, a new business, you're getting married. I can't think of any other examples right now. Those are two of the main ones, but basically you can do electional astrology where you elect or choose the time to begin something new. So it's almost like reverse engineering and picking a time where the positions of the planets give you the best chance of success, basically. And that's based on the very specifics of whatever the situation is. If it's a business, the nature of the business. And so using the symbols of astrology to basically, you can't kind of control and override life, but you can give yourself the best chance and start something at the best time. So those are always fun kinds of readings for me to do, because it's like you get to play around and move the chart and look at all these dates over a few weeks or month and come up with when's the best time to do it. And it doesn't guarantee success, but like I say, it can put you in a better position. Like, for example, when Mercury is retrograde, we often hear, oh my God, Mercury is retrograde. It's a really bad time to sign any kind of contract, because Mercury is said to rule or symbolize all written communication, including contracts. So chances are if you sign an important contract, there'll be issues with it down the line, to give one example. And you can also use astrology comparing charts, so relationship, sometimes called synastry readings of, again, usually romantic relationships, of what are the dynamics here, what are our key challenges, how do we work through this issue, why is this happening, why does this keep happening. So using this guide as not just helping an individual person, but helping within the context of a relationship.
Is that usually one person coming to you or both?
It's about 50-50. But for ethical reasons, I always insist on, if it's only one person, that we have the other person's permission. Because, looking and talking about someone's chart, it's very personal and very private. And people who don't understand astrology don't know quite what they're revealing about themselves when they show you their chart. And so, if it's just one person that's interested, then the other person has to at least give their permission.
Yeah, great. So if people are interested in working with you, they can contact you via your website?
Via my website, which is, you'll probably have it written somewhere, but it's my name, Mark Flaherty, with a hyphen in between, mark-flaherty.com.
Okay, great. One thing I usually close the podcast with is a question what do you think these plants or astrology, really what you're interested in, what do you think they're trying to teach humans? It's a big question.
Just that. What are they trying to teach humans? Well, I suppose I go back to, in terms of astrology, part of how I described it earlier of moving in harmony with what life wants for us. So essentially about a tool for living our own personal full potential, which is different for everyone. Astrology is a guide and a tool for helping us to live that, to live in harmony with what life wants for us, which is the same as our deepest desire. And I think that's unique for everyone. There's no, and this is what it is. It's, I guess, what astrology shows me with the infinite variety and possible configurations of a chart is we're all completely different and we're all here to do something different. And so astrology can help us clarify what that is for us. And I don't think it really matters what that is in the external world other than this is what's right for me. And so, yeah, helping us understand our own personal self, our life journey, and yeah, what we're here to do, create, evolve into, something like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, great. I appreciate it, Mark. That was a great interview.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, thanks for coming on.
Fun to talk about astrology.
Yeah. Yeah, well, if you think of something else, maybe we do it again one time.
Sure.
Yeah. All right, perfect. Okay, everybody. So that's it. I hope you all enjoyed the podcast. As always, if you can go on YouTube and hit the subscribe button and go on Apple Podcasts and leave a starred rating and a review, that would really help with the algorithms and just getting this show out to a broader audience. So if you can take a second and do that, I'd really appreciate that. And if you're able to get back and to support the show, I would really appreciate that. It does take, some work putting these shows together. And if you're able to support that, I would be deeply, deeply grateful for that. So anyone who has supported the show in that way, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Patreon is a really good option. You can go on there, and for just a couple dollars a month, you can subscribe. And there's some really nice added benefits like early access to shows, Q&As, bonus material. So it's a nice way to give back and also to receive something. So that's it. I think my next guest is going to be a friend of mine who's a mindfulness-based psychotherapist. I really enjoyed that conversation. She's also recently done the MAPS psychedelic assisted therapy training with MDMA, and that seems to be one of the big directions this work is moving in. So that was a really good episode. I also spoke to my friend Marta, who's a yoga teacher. That'll probably come out in a couple weeks. She's actually offline for the month of September, so I'm waiting a little bit to release that one. I think my friend Al is going to come on, who's a facilitator of this plant work. He also works at the Temple of the Way of Light. And also my friend Felix, who lives here where I am in the Sacred Valley, and he also holds space with different medicines, and he's trained a long time under the Shipibo. And I think I'm also going to have Leela back on, who is the Shipibo curandera, who I interviewed a few episodes ago. I think she's going to come on to talk more kind of intimately about the work, how she's working, what's going on in ceremony. And also another Shipibo who I work with named Damian. We're going to try and get him on too. Unfortunately, his signal is pretty bad, so we're trying to figure a way to make that happen. So thank you guys all for tuning in, and I'll see you on future episodes.
từng ngày